our chalice this morning. Good morning. Our opening words this morning are a blessing for traveling in the dark. And while we are in a very brightly lit, beautiful, sunny sanctuary this morning, I do think that many of our spiritual journeys happen in literal or metaphorical darkness. So I invite you to imagine yourself into the space of this poem. Go slow, if you can. Slower. More slowly still. Friendly dark or fearsome, this is no place to break your neck by rushing, by running, by crashing into what you cannot see. Then again, it is true, different darks have different tasks, and if you have arrived here unawares, if you have come in peril or in pain, this might be no place that you should dawdle. I do not know what these shadows ask of you, what they might hold that means you good or ill. It is not for me to reckon whether you should linger or you should leave. But this is what I can ask for you, that in the darkness there be a blessing, that in the shadows there be a welcome, that in the night you be encompassed by the love that knows your name. We will sing our opening hymn together, and I did not bring my order of service, but I think it's Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire. 34? It's 34.
Would you join with me in the unison affirmation which is printed in your order of service? Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. El amor es el espíritu de esta iglesia, y el servicio es su ley. Este es nuestro gran pacto, vivir juntos en paz, buscar la verdad en el amor y ayudarnos los unos a los otros. Thank you. Please be seated. Well, good morning, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you to First Parish in Bedford on this crisp and beautiful February day. I'm Deborah Weiner, Interim Director of Religious Education here at First Parish, and we are glad that you are here. We welcome you just as you are, whatever is going well or maybe not so well in your life right now. We are glad that you came in our door on this day. We celebrate the many diversities among us of age, race, class, varying abilities, sexual orientation or gender identity, religious and political beliefs. We are a Unitarian Universalist congregation, and we are united by shared values, including mutual respect, compassion, taking care of this earth, justice, and striving for peace. And this is how we try to live our faith. We are glad to welcome Ron Cordes to the pulpit to lead our worship today. Ron, thank you so much. Following the service, join us for Community Hour, which is in the common room. You can go out through either of these doors. Make sure that if you are visiting, you stop by the welcome table on your way to Community Hour if you'd like to find out more about us, or if you would like to tell us more about you. You can also fill out a blue connection card during the service. They should be in the pew racks that you see in front of you if you'd like to stay in touch with us. Speaking of community, we will be saying farewell today to Jennifer Johnson, who has served us as our student minister since late summer. We are sad to see her go, but we wish her well as she continues on her path toward professional ministry. We will cut a cake to honor Jen in Community Hour, and you'll have a chance to speak with her then, to say farewell and to show your appreciation for her time with us. Thank you, Jen, so much for all that you have brought to First Parish in Bedford. In the back of your order of service, I want to call your attention to the announcement and the calendar section. There's a lot in there. Don't forget about the art gallery reception today after the service, as a new display of art opens on our upper level with art from Brogan Joe Murphy and Mary Aloise Firestone. I hope I said those names correctly. Lee Vorderer reminds us that we need more people to volunteer to drive our friends from Carlton Willard for worship. Tomorrow, Lee will send out a link to our ANO list for you to volunteer, and thanks in advance for that. Next Sunday, don't forget that worship will be led by Carlene Griffith-Sekou, leader of Black Lives Matter Boston. Be sure to be here to connect with Carlene's perspectives and her inspiring call to all of us. Next week, we will begin showing the video Long Strange Trip that Ron produced and masterminded, and that will occur following worship next Sunday and for the subsequent 5 Sundays. Sorry, the subsequent 2 Sundays. I was stringing it out more. Come to one, come to all of them. Ron tells us that there will be a light lunch available before each film screening. And by no means last, join your friends at this afternoon's Valentine's concert sponsored by the Music Committee. You have a flyer in your order of service about it. It sounds like a delightful experience. And if the music isn't enough to lure you, I hear that there's chocolate following the concert. So make sure you don't miss that. Thank you, and again, welcome to First Parish in Bedford. Annie's got our time for all ages.
So I have a question. Has anyone ever felt like they had to choose between 2 different sides where you really didn't want to have to choose? I'm seeing some nodding. Yeah, people have had that experience. Has anyone ever told you that if you care about this thing over here, then that means you must not care about that thing over there? Has anybody ever told you that? You know when that happened to me most recently? I was mentioned in an article in the newspaper about my work with an immigration accompaniment network. And I saw in some of the comments that some people said that I shouldn't care about immigrants because I should care about homeless people. And I thought that was really weird, because why can't I care about both? Also, what about homeless immigrants? So that seemed very weird to me. But this seems to be the mentality that some people have in their heads, this or that. Now, there were some people who felt this way about some really, really important issues back in the 1800s, a long time ago. There were some people, and some of them were Unitarians, our predecessors, and they thought that we needed to get rid of slavery. And they were right, because slavery was a really awful, cruel, just terrible institution in our country and throughout the Americas, where white people were treating people from Africa and their kids and their kids' kids like they were property, like they weren't even people. And that was horrible. And they were right to say that we had to abolish it, which means get rid of it. Abolish is a big word, and they were abolitionists. But there were some other people who cared about another thing that was also very, very important, and this was that they thought that also women were people, which was another good idea, I think. They thought that white women should be able to vote in elections. That was another great idea. Now, there were some people who thought that you could care about getting rid of slavery but not care about women, or that you could care about women but not focus on caring about black people or slavery. And you know, one of the big things that you may be thinking is, but what about the black women? That's a thought. But not everybody thought that you had to pick one of these issues. Luckily, some people understood that they were actually connected. And one of those people who I think is really cool is someone that Ron Cordes reminded me about when we were talking about this service, and her name is Julia Ward Howe. Now, does anybody know what Julia Ward Howe is most famous for? Does anybody know? I see a hand. Shout it out. Battle Hymn of the Republic. That's a song. It goes, glory, glory, hallelujah. It's a common song that you've maybe heard before. She wrote some words to that song about God being on the side of the Union Army in the Civil War, which was a war where some people were trying to leave our country so they could keep their slaves, and other people were wanting to keep the country together but not have slavery. And she said, God is on the side of the people trying to get rid of slavery. And she wrote this song. Does anybody know what else Julia Ward Howe is often credited with? She has a reading in our hymnal about this idea. Does anybody know? She wrote a really fierce, intense proclamation for a Mother's Day for peace. And I really like it because it's really intense, and it says, our husbands shall not come to us reeking of carnage, which is a really intense way of being like, we should not be okay with our sons and husbands going out and killing people. That's awful. And she saw from the Civil War how terrible war was, and she was really against war. So those are two things that made her really famous. But one thing I thought was so cool about Julia Ward Howe is she said, we cannot be over here just saying women should be able to vote and not caring about the black people who've recently been freed from slavery. And also, we should not be over here where her husband was, her own husband, saying, I care a lot about getting rid of slavery, but I don't think women should be out and about doing anything. I think they should just stay at home. That's what her own husband thought. But she said, no, I'm not down with this. And she helped to create an organization of women who were fighting for the right to vote and also fighting for the rights of black people. And I think that is really cool. So if you ever find that people are telling you you have to care about this or that, you have to pick this side or that side, I want you to remember Julia Ward Howe and how she said we got to care about getting everybody free, and how she was a pioneer in our faith And we believe that too. That's my message for you today. We're going to sing Spirit of Life so that we can go to our classes, those of us who are going to Sunday school. It's number 1, 2, 3 in the hymnal.
Good morning. I guess first I want to apologize for turning my back on some dear friends, but that's the way this is set up. These are my backup singers. Although I have to admit they have a lot better chance of being the Miracles than I do of being Smokey Robinson. These are the words of Mackie Alston, an openly gay theologian who also happens to be an award-winning film documentarian. Imagine this. You are showing a film about the faltering and the flowering faith lives of a handful of New Yorkers, an African-American Muslim, an atheist Jew, a gay Christian, a born-again Buddhist, at a rural college to an audience of 1,000 white Lutheran teenagers from church youth groups across the state of Minnesota. You're asking yourself, how is it that my film was chosen for this audience? You're wondering what kind of vegetables they have prepared to throw at you. The discussion is rich after the film, which feels like an act of grace. But the breathtaking conversations happen after most of the audience has left. With the boy who until that moment was convinced he was going to hell for being gay. With the girl who was convinced she was insane for having lost her faith. With the gaggle of blonde children who had never met a Muslim, who had only seen them as terrorists in the movies and on the news, and until your film had been convinced they were just plain evil people. Making and presenting a documentary is, in my experience, a deeply religious experience. At a recent screening at the Harvard Divinity School of my last documentary, these are still his words, not mine, A woman in the audience asked if documentary filmmaking is a spiritual practice. I had never thought of it as such, but as I began to reflect on the process of making a documentary film, of tracking down the sacred in everyday life, of sifting through hours and hours of footage for truth and meaning, and then holding it up for the world to appreciate, I began to say it is so. In my films, I explore how people reconcile faith with suffering, and in the course of the films, as I witness the heroic power of people to choose life in the face of death, I move in my own beliefs from great doubt to deep faith. I have indeed found filmmaking, the act and art of seeing, to be a profound spiritual practice. First Parish in Bedford has many spiritual practices. One of them is the spirituality of generosity. You know, I think it says a lot about what a church thinks of its preacher if it collects the offering before or after the sermon. For the good work of this church, both within and far beyond these walls, our offering will now be collected before the sermon. Several weeks ago here, John Gibbons did a two-part sermon in which he explored the concept of grace. Well, at the second one, I was waiting for him to explore the concept of Frankie. No such luck. But John did speak of a state of grace, not as something delivered from above, but as a thing that grows out of profound human interactions. I left church that morning thinking John has just reclaimed the notion of grace from the theists. Today, I'm going to try to do the same for spirituality. I want to reclaim the concept of spirituality away from supernatural forces. I want to try to present it to you as a thing that arises from deep within the human heart, solely from earthly things which move us deeply. Things which make us cry, and not out of loss or despair, but out of extraordinary beauty or great acts of human compassion, or just simply overwhelming joy. Spiritual is a word that I use today for the feeling I had at being present at the birth of our two children. Watching these new lives come into the world affected me very deeply spiritually. Spiritual is a word I use for watching a rocket that I had worked on for 18 months unceasingly lift off from Cape Canaveral to carry 3 men who I had come to know very well into orbit aboard Apollo 7. Spiritual is a word I use for watching the sunrise over the Grand Canyon one cold February morning. Spiritual is the word I use today to describe these events. It is not the word I would have used at the time. Back then, spiritual to me meant religious, as it may still to you. But I was anything but that. So what changed me? What was my Paul on the road to Damascus moment? Let me see if I can frame it for you. As Mackie Alston said in my reading, making and presenting a documentary can be a profound spiritual practice. 20 years ago, as I was wrapping up a career as an engineer, I would never have imagined myself making such a ridiculous statement. Yet here I stand before you today testifying to that fact. See, it is possible to teach an old dog a new trick. So how did I go from being an engineer whose entire career was spent logically, rationally thinking through and solving problems, to a storyteller testifying to the spiritual fulfillment I get from making a successful documentary film? Like the title of my documentary on Unitarian Universalist history, the one we'll begin showing here again in 2 weeks, it has been a long, strange trip. We UUs do a terrible job of telling our own story. Where did we come from? How did we get here? Who invented this UU thing? Does our history go all the way back to the merger in 1961 between the Unitarians and the Universalists? Well, what about Channing? William Ellery, not Carroll. Did he invent the whole thing? What about Emerson and Thoreau? Where do they fit in? Were they Unitarians? They called themselves transcendentalists. I told you I'd mix them up once. They called themselves transcendentalists. What is that about? Oh, and don't forget Margaret Fuller, who held the wheels on the whole transcendentalist thing while Emerson and Thoreau were out gallivanting around Walden Woods. We UUs do a terrible job of telling our own story. I was not raised a Unitarian, as I think many of you were not. I was introduced to Unitarian Universalism in 1981 by a UU minister, Reverend Dean Stark, who I met out at Star Island. I guess that makes me a born-again Unitarian. So I missed whatever we teach our RE kids about our own history. Do we teach our RE kids about our own history? Do we teach our new members? When Kathy and I joined this church in 1990, there was no such education available to us. You do a terrible job of telling our own story. But how did I get here? How did me, an old engineer, step forward to tell this long, strange story? Okay, I was born in New Orleans at a very young age. I was raised in an extremely conservative German Lutheran church, Missouri Synod, for those of you keeping score. This church was so conservative that when they merged with the evangelical church, it was the evangelicals who were the more moderate part of the merger. When I was 12 or thereabouts, I went into a new grade in Sunday school, which began instructing us in the catechism. Our teacher was the church's minister. Now, for those of you who have never had the pleasure of being indoctrinated into a doctrinaire church, the catechism is your Bible. It tells you precisely what you must believe, word for word. Now, I've always been a curious kid. When something happens that doesn't make any sense to me, I want to know why. Probably why I became an engineer in the first place. So one Sunday morning, while we were waiting for the 8 o'clock service to begin, a black family, this is in the middle 1950s, you understand, a black family, Bibles in hand, walked into the church. They were immediately stopped by one of the ushers, and after a short conversation, they were quietly escorted out. In catechism class, I asked the minister, why? Because we don't want those kind of people in our church, was his simple answer. But didn't we just study that Jesus said we must invite in the stranger? Well, you can imagine the rest of that conversation. Anyway, he eventually told me that I really didn't understand what Christianity was all about. And facetiously, I now think, he suggested that I sit down and read my Bible before asking him any more stupid questions. Well, I was raised that when your minister tells you to do something, you do it. Bob, can you edit that last part out before John gets to see it? Anyway, over the next several years, I did just that. I read the whole Bible, cover to cover, and I learned a very important lesson. I learned that what Jesus preached and what my church practiced were two entirely different things. Quite often, they contradicted each other. It was then, I think, that I added the word hypocrite to my growing vocabulary. But reading the Bible left me with a deep sense of Judeo-Christian history, and for the first time, an interest in history itself. And so when I left home for college, I like to say I left the way Lot left Sodom. Genesis 19. In my undergraduate years, I took a 2-semester world history course under one of the 2 greatest teachers I've ever had, a man named T. Harry Williams. Williams taught me that most historical recountings are fables, either wittingly or unwittingly slanted to tell the story the author wants to tell. He said, to get as close as possible to the historical truth, you must first identify whose parts of the story are not being told, and then go find out what their story is, and then try your best to reconcile the two. Williams cautioned us to be especially suspicious of anything that was billed as nonfiction, especially history, but also books, movies, the occasional State of the Union address. You know, I read on the internet the other day that Abraham Lincoln once said, you should never trust everything you read on the internet. T. Harry Williams taught me one other thing that year: an appreciation for the art of oral history. Oral history is when you allow a first-person witness to an event to tell their own story in their own words without outside coaching or being asked questions. So think about this. Suppose I were to interview you. As soon as I ask you a question, I am immediately shaping your story around my question. My choice of questions injects my own prejudices into your story. That is not the way oral history works. Okay, fast forward to November 22nd, 1998, the 35th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy, a cold Sunday night in Boston. Maybe a dozen of us were gathered in the meeting room at 110 Arlington Street, the UU Urban Ministry Building, for a meeting of the UUA Racial Justice Coordinating Council. Those of us who got there early were standing around just chatting, talking about Kennedy, doing the "where were you when you heard the news" thing. As we waited, one of our members, Reverend Jack Mendelson, who used to be minister here and was, up until he passed away, our minister emeritus, entered the room with a look on his face that brought the conversation to a halt. "What's wrong?" several people asked, concerned about Jack's frail health. "Henry Hampton died today," was Jack's simple answer. Well, so much for the meeting agenda. For the next several hours, we all sat around telling Henry Hampton stories. Okay, not all of us. While I certainly knew of the man who produced the award-winning PBS series Eyes on the Prize, I had never met him, but the others sure did. And what stories they told. The march from Selma to Montgomery, the formation of the UU Black Affairs Council, the tumultuous 1969 General Assembly in Boston, and the walkout at that GA that almost fractured the then 8-year-old UUA. And something called the Black Empowerment Controversy. That night was the first time I heard those three words, which would set my feet on a path I had never imagined I would walk. As the evening was winding down, the Reverend Mel Hoover, who was then head of the UUA Faith and Action Department, shook his head sadly as he and I were putting on our coats and mumbled, "Henry had important stories to tell that we will never hear." Indeed, many of the key players of that era were by then in their 70s and 80s and even 90s. There were a lot of other important stories that needed to be heard, and heard quickly. As I drove home that night, the idea of an oral history project to record forever those important stories began to grow in my head. So I enlisted two friends of color from the council, Billy Seaborn and Bill Norris. Billy used to go to church here, to apply with me to the UU funding panel for some seed money. The panel's quick answer was, "No, we don't fund films, sorry." Well, never one to take no for an answer. I talked Jack Mendelson into sitting down with me right up there in the bacon room and filming his story, all 90 minutes of it. Out of that, I edited about 10 incredibly powerful minutes of Jack describing the walkout of the 1969 GA, which at the time was probably the most pivotal single event in the history of the UUA. I then asked Hillary Goodridge, the director of the funding panel, to sit down and watch it with me. We got our money. And so an oral history project began to take shape. Over the next 4 years, the three of us traveled the continent, talking to direct first-person participants in the so-called Black Empowerment Controversy who were willing to talk to us. We also had many doors slammed in our face, many unreturned phone calls, many people who, upon learning what we were asking of them, just turned around and walked out of the room. Such was the depths of the emotions 30 years later. Even the people who would talk to us were almost instantly swept up in those emotions, especially the people of color for whom this was a particularly painful time. I can't tell you how many people agreed to be videotaped saying blithely, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll tell you my story, take about 10 minutes." An hour later, they're weeping, pounding on the table in anger. During this time, we videotaped the oral history witness of almost 100 people, some 120 hours of tape. Today, I am proud to say those tapes live in the Smithsonian Archives in Washington, D.C. But before I let the Smithsonian have the tapes, I spent another year going through them, making notes, and eventually editing various film clips into a 75-minute documentary which I titled Wilderness Journey. Because that's exactly what the Black empowerment movement was, a journey through wilderness that no religious denomination had ever dared to traverse. Making Wilderness Journey was a remarkable spiritual experience for me. The act of just being there, being a present witness to the story being told without guiding or reacting to the storyteller in any way other than open acceptance, was for me transcendental. I was caught up in the unfolding before me and swept up in the intense emotions of the storytellers. Wilderness Journey has been an unqualified success. Since its premiere at the Boston GA in 2003, over 1,000 copies of the DVD have been distributed. I was told 4 or 5 years ago that the UUA Ministerial Fellowship Committee now requires all candidates coming before it to have watched the film. And by the way, Jen told me this morning that in her Meadville Lombard UU history class, they're now showing Long Strange Trip, the 6-part series we're going to be showing in 2 weeks. Black empowerment controversy was a story that had been swept under the UU rug for 30 years and is today a part of the UUA mainstream. We UUs do a terrible job of telling our own story, especially when it does not have a happy ending. Wilderness Journey rekindled my unsatisfied interest in the history of our movement. John Gibbons had introduced me and many of you to a significant part of our early UU history by fostering our partner church relationship with our brother and sister Unitarians in Transylvania. But what relationship could those Unitarians possibly have to us here today? I mean, after all, Transylvanian Unitarianism began in the 16th century. There weren't even very many English settlers in the New World by then. So I started looking for a good, thorough history of Unitarian Universalism to try to answer my questions. I found a whole bunch of books of varying degrees of density, from Charles Howe's eminently readable For Faith and Freedom, all the way to Earl Morse Wilbur's 2-volume, 1,600-page Our Unitarian Heritage, which is a prescription quality cure for insomnia. I read all of them. In my library at home is a 3-foot-long shelf full of them. But in all of that, there is not one book that I would point you to that tells the whole story of Unitarian Universalism in a way you might enjoy casually reading it. Did I mention we UUs do a terrible job of telling our own story? So, of course, me being me, I decided to make a film. Piece of cake, right? I naively expected to make a single film comparable in size to Wilderness Journey, 60 to 90 minutes long. A project I figured would take maybe 18 months to complete. Besides, it would be great fun to travel across the United States and Europe on somebody else's nickel. But first, I had to make sure that that somebody else's nickel was available. So I wrote up the concept and presented it to the same UU funding panel that had funded Wilderness Journey. 5 years earlier, they would have very politely shown me the door again, because their policy was unchanged. It was still, we don't fund films. But this time I walked into the room with some street cred. Wilderness Journey turned out to be a very powerful calling card. I walked out with the first year's funding and a promise that more would be available when I needed it. So I began writing a script and learning of people I had never heard of, and writing and learning of important events that I had never encountered, and writing and learning and writing. Stop. The story I was trying to tell was getting away from me. I had over 10 hours of video in that script. Andy Warhol would be so proud. It was time for what for me is the hardest part of writing, the what to leave in, what to leave out decision making. After several very painful re-edits, I cut the script from over 10 hours down to 6, a far cry from the 90 minutes I had first imagined. The 2,000-year-long story of the development of Unitarian and Universalist thought turned out to be a longer and stranger trip than ever I had imagined. So naturally, being a longtime Grateful Dead fan, I titled the thing Long Strange Trip. But then it was time to start filming. With a small all-volunteer crew, we visited 6 of these United States before daring to hop across the pond to the 11 European countries we had to visit. I made 3 separate trips to Europe with 3 different film crews. On one trip, a single 3-week marathon through 8 European countries, we put 6,000 kilometers on the rental van, but we got it done. The film took 3 years and produced 60 hours of tape. So yeah, there are plenty of outtakes. And no, you're not likely to see any of them, because when I mess up on camera, I tend to reprimand myself in language not suitable for religious audiences. Finally, after 2 years of writing, 3 years of filming, and a year of editing, Long Strange Trip emerged, all 6 DVDs of it. The feedback that I received from the now 600 copies that are in circulation have been extremely heartwarming. I'm very thankful to the people who took the time to let me know both how Long Strange Trip and Wilderness Journey have affected their lives. Because when you make a documentary film, you are creating something that can affect people's lives. You are creating something that can and almost certainly will affect your own life. Creating both of these films have truly changed my life and changed my sense of spirituality. To my great surprise, it has been, without question, one of the most spiritually uplifting things I have ever done. Ever. Let's sing. When we were putting Wilderness Journey together, my late friend Bill Norris was in charge of the background music. Bill decided there was only one hymn that described what our witnesses were trying to do. So in Bill's memory, let's sing Carolyn McDade's wonderful We'll Build a Land, number 121. Ralph Waldo Emerson believed that a person could overcome their circumstances and become the person they want to be by using the spirituality inside them without the need for princes or priests. So how do you define your own spirituality? What turns you on? What floats your boat? What is it that makes you cry just out of the sheer beauty of the scene? Seek this out. This is the innermost you reacting to the world around you. It is your soul speaking to you. Ooh, there's another word I want to reclaim from the theists. Go now in peace, my friends, and be well.